Some moments in life make time stand still, when the past and present collide in ways no one ever expects. As a veteran stands at a gravesite to honor a fallen brother, a voice from the crowd changes everything. Who is she, and why does her words leave everyone frozen in place? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that honor those who serve. Henry Lawson adjusted the stiff collar of his dress uniform, feeling the weight of his medals pulling against his chest. They were polished, gleaming in the late afternoon sun, but to him they were just metal and ribbon, silent reminders of a past filled with sacrifice. His hands, steady as they had been in combat, now trembled slightly as he gripped the folded American flag in his arms. This wasn't just another funeral. This wasn't just another name etched in stone. It was his name, not literally, but in every way that mattered. James "Jimmy" Carter. Not the former president, but his best friend, the one man who had watched Henry's back in the jungles of Vietnam. Jimmy had taken Henry under his wing when he was just a young recruit, fresh out of training and unprepared for the raw brutality of war. They had fought side by side, laughed in the rare moments of peace, and made a pact, one that Henry had failed to keep. And now, decades later, Henry stood before Jimmy's final resting place, haunted by that unfulfilled promise. The crowd gathered in solemn silence. Rows of veterans, their faces lined with years of hardship, stood in quiet respect. Some in wheelchairs, some gripping canes, others simply bowing their heads as the honor guard prepared for the 21-gun salute. A few civilians were present. Family, friends, maybe some who barely knew Jimmy but had come out of respect for a soldier's sacrifice. Henry took a breath. He had prepared this speech 100 times, but now that he was here, staring at the simple headstone bearing Jimmy's name, the words felt empty. What could he possibly say that would be enough? How could he put a lifetime of gratitude, regret, and brotherhood into just a few sentences? James Carter was more than a soldier, Henry finally spoke, his voice steady but thick with emotion. He was a friend, a brother, the kind of man who would have given his last meal if it meant keeping someone else alive, and he did, more than once. A faint murmur moved through the crowd, some knowing nods, others swallowing the lump in their throats. "I was there the day he gave his life," Henry continued. He didn't need to say more. Some wounds ran too deep for details, and I made him a promise, one I should have kept long ago. He looked down at the flag in his hands. This was it. This was the moment he had waited decades for. But just as he took a step forward to present the flag, movement caught his eye. A figure, standing near the back, small, hesitant, a young woman, no older than her mid-20s, clutching something against her chest. She hadn't been there before, and then she spoke. "Sergeant Lawson." The entire cemetery fell silent. Henry froze. It wasn't just the voice, it was the way she said his name, firm but uncertain, as if she had rehearsed it a dozen times before stepping forward. The wind carried the whisper of her words through the rows of white headstones, but to Henry they might as well have been shouted across a battlefield. The young woman stood near the edge of the crowd, hesitant but unwavering. She was clutching something, an old leather notebook, worn at the edges, the kind soldiers used to carry in their breast pockets. Henry swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. The rifle shots from the 21-gun salute cracked through the cemetery, but he barely flinched. Decades of discipline told him to stand still, to remain composed, but everything inside him was unraveling. She stepped closer. I didn't mean to interrupt," she said, her voice softer now. I needed to be here." The honor guard finished their salute, the sharp click of their boots punctuating the silence that followed. People were shifting now, whispering among themselves, watching Henry. He turned fully to face her. Up close, she was young, mid-20s, maybe, but her eyes carried something old, something that didn't belong in someone her age. A deep sadness, a quiet strength. She held out the notebook. "This belonged to my father," she said. Henry felt the weight of those words settle deep in his chest. His fingers twitched, but he didn't reach for it. Not yet. Your father, his voice was lower than he intended, almost hoarse. She nodded. James Carter, she said. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. For a moment Henry could hear nothing but his own pulse hammering in his ears. He had prepared for this day, prepared to speak about his friend, to honor his memory, but he had not prepared for this. That can't be, he said before he could stop himself. The young woman, Carter's daughter, Jimmy's daughter, took a deep breath. I know this doesn't make sense, but he left this behind for you. She lifted the notebook again. And I think you need to see what's inside. Henry hesitated, but something deep inside him, something old, told him to take it. His hands, which had been steady through years of battle, through pain, through funerals just like this one, trembled as he reached forward. The leather was cracked and aged, but the moment his fingers touched it, memories rushed back. This was real. This was Jimmy's. He opened the notebook slowly, his eyes scanning the first page, and then his breath caught in his throat. There, written in Jimmy's familiar handwriting, were the words Henry had never expected to see. If anything happens to me, find her. Henry's breath came slow and shallow as he stared at the words inked into the notebook's worn pages. If anything happens to me, find her. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the past with the present. Jimmy Carter had never mentioned a daughter, not once. They had spent years together in Vietnam, sharing everything, hopes, fears, regrets, but not this. How could Henry have not known? The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, heavier than any metal he had ever worn. His hands trembled as he turned the page, feeling as though he were reading a letter from a ghost. More words, written in Jimmy's unmistakable handwriting, greeted him. Henry, if you're reading this, then I didn't make it home. Henry swallowed hard, the lump in his throat almost unbearable. The air around him grew still, as if the world itself had paused to let him absorb the weight of what he was about to read. I know you, old friend. You're probably blaming yourself. Don't. It wasn't your fault. But if there's one last thing I can ask of you, it's this. Take care of my little girl. Henry's grip on the notebook tightened. Little girl. He slowly lifted his eyes to the young woman standing before him. She was waiting, watching, her fingers knotted together as if bracing for whatever reaction might come next. How is this possible? Henry's voice cracked. My mom told me about you, she said, but only once. When I was a kid, I found this notebook hidden away in a box. I asked her about it, and she said my father had a best friend in the Army, someone she never got to meet, someone he trusted more than anyone. Henry felt his knees weaken, the truth hitting him harder than any bullet ever had. Jimmy had a family, a daughter. In all these years, Henry had no idea. I tried to find you, she continued, her voice soft but determined. But I didn't have much to go on. I didn't even know if you were still alive. Then, last week, I found out about this service. I saw your name listed as the one giving the eulogy. Henry exhaled sharply, as if the very breath had been knocked from his lungs. Jimmy's daughter had been searching for him. He looked back down at the notebook. Jimmy's words blurred for a moment, before sharpening into focus. I wanted to tell you about her so many times, but war has a way of making men believe they'll live forever. I was waiting for the right moment. Guess that moment never came. But I need you to know this, Henry. She is the best thing I ever did in this life. If I don't make it home, she's all that matters. Henry clenched his jaw, his eyes burning. All these years he had carried guilt, regret, and the weight of unfulfilled promises. And now, standing before him, was his final chance to set things right. I didn't know, Henry admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I know, she said, but you do now. And that changed everything. Henry felt like the earth had shifted beneath him. For years he had carried the ghosts of war, the faces of the men he had lost, the weight of the promises he had failed to keep. But this was something different. This wasn't a battlefield memory that could be tucked away in the dark corners of his mind. This was flesh and blood, standing before him, carrying the last piece of a friend he had sworn to never forget. Jimmy's daughter. The realization settled deep, pressing down on his chest. He had no words, just the lingering sound of her voice as it echoed in his mind. "But you do now." She was right. He knew now, and he couldn't ignore it. Henry glanced at the notebook still gripped in his hands, his fingers pressing into the worn leather as if it might slip away if he let go. The words inside were a message from a man long gone, yet they carried a weight heavier than anything he had ever faced in combat. "Take care of my little girl." The air between them felt thick, heavy with emotions neither of them knew how to navigate. Around them, the funeral continued. The honor guard folded the flag with quiet precision, the ceremonial movement second nature to men who had done this far too many times. But Henry wasn't watching them. He was watching her. She had Jimmy's eyes. That much was clear now, the same sharpness, the same quiet fire burning behind them. But there was something else, too, something guarded, like she had spent years carrying questions that had never been answered. "I don't even know your name," Henry finally said, his voice hoarse. She blinked, almost as if she had forgotten he wouldn't already know. "Emily," she said. "Emily Carter." He exhaled, nodding slowly. The name settled in his mind like a missing puzzle piece, one he hadn't even known was missing. "I should have been there," he admitted, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "I should have known." Emily's lips pressed together, her grip tightening on the strap of her purse. "My mom never wanted me to look back. She said my father's past wasn't something I needed to carry." She paused, her gaze flickering to the gravestone. "But I wanted to understand. I wanted to know who he really was." Henry swallowed hard. "He was the best man I ever knew," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I don't just mean as a soldier." Emily nodded, her jaw tightening as if she were holding something back. "I've spent my whole life wondering what he would have told me if he had the chance." Henry looked down at the notebook again. The answer was right there, written decades ago. "He would have told you that you were his world," Henry said. Emily's breath hitched. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with everything they didn't know how to say yet. Henry had lost a brother all those years ago. Now, standing before him was the only piece of Jimmy left in the world. And for the first time in decades, Henry knew this was a promise he wouldn't break. Henry had seen war. He had walked through fire, heard the cries of men in their final moments, and carried the weight of lives lost on his shoulders. But standing here now, looking at Emily Carter, he felt something entirely different. A kind of fear he had never known before. This wasn't a fight he could win with strategy. There were no enemies, no battle formations, no tactics to rely on. There was only the past, long buried but never truly gone, rising up in front of him in the form of the daughter of his best friend. He didn't know how to be what she needed. Hell, he wasn't even sure if she needed him at all. Emily stared at him, waiting. Maybe for an answer, maybe just to see if he would walk away. She had been carrying this, the weight of her father's absence, the questions about his life, for years. And now she was here, notebook in hand, looking for something she wasn't even sure she would find. Henry finally let out a breath and shifted his grip on the leather-bound pages, the worn edges rough against his fingertips. "Your mother," he started, his voice lower now, uncertain. "Did she ever—" "She never talked about him," Emily interrupted, shaking her head. "Not really. I mean, I knew he was a soldier, I knew he died overseas, but she never told me what kind of man he was." Henry clenched his jaw. That didn't surprise him. A lot of families did that, shut the door on the past, sealed it tight, tried to move on like the ghosts of war wouldn't follow. But they always did, no matter how deep you buried them. "He wrote about you," Henry said, tapping the notebook gently. "Not just in here, in letters." Emily's eyebrows lifted, her breath catching. "Letters?" Henry nodded. "Yeah. He used to write them at night, after missions when things were quiet. He never mailed them, we never really had the chance. but he kept them in his pack. He hesitated, swallowing hard. I had them for a long time after he died. Emily's expression shifted, shock, disbelief, something unreadable flickering across her face. "You had them?" she whispered. Henry looked away for a moment, feeling a tightness in his chest that hadn't been there before. "I kept them with me when I came home, meant to get them to your mother, but by the time I was in the right headspace to do it, she was already gone." He exhaled, shaking his head. "I failed you, Emily. I failed both of you." Emily was silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, she said, "You were a soldier, too." Henry frowned. "What?" She lifted her chin, her voice steady but not unkind. "You were at war. You weren't just my father's best friend. You were fighting to survive, just like he was. You didn't fail anyone." Henry felt something shift deep inside him, something he had held onto for decades. He had carried guilt for so long, guilt that he made it home when Jimmy hadn't, guilt that he hadn't done enough. But standing here now, hearing the certainty in Emily's voice, something cracked. Maybe she was right. He cleared his throat and adjusted his posture. "I still have them," he said. "The letters, if you want them." Emily's eyes glistened, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. "I do." Henry nodded, the promise in his heart solidifying. Then, with quiet resolve, he said, "Then they're yours." Henry had never been a man of many words, but now, standing here with Emily Carter, he found himself drowning in unspoken ones. For decades he had kept Jimmy's letters packed away, locked inside a box that sat untouched in the back of his closet. It wasn't that he didn't want to deliver them, it was that he couldn't. Every time he tried, his hands would tremble, his chest would tighten, and the memories would come rushing back. But now there is no more running from it. Emily's eyes searched his, waiting for the confirmation she needed, waiting for proof that her father had thought about her, that he had loved her, that she had mattered to him in a way she had never been sure of. Henry had seen that look before, not in Emily, but in the soldiers he had served with, in the men who had been left behind to wonder if their sacrifice had been worth it. She was just like Jimmy in that way. "I don't live far from here," Henry said, his voice steady. "The letters are back at my place. If you want, you can come with me. I'll give them to you myself." Emily hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. It was clear she hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to walk away from this funeral with anything but unanswered questions. But now there were answers waiting for her. "Yes," she said, nodding firmly. "I want to see them." Henry nodded back, as if they had just sealed an unspoken agreement. The rest of the service continued around them, but Henry barely heard it. The sound of the bugle playing taps, the murmurs of those gathered, the shuffling of boots on the grass. It was all a distant hum. His mind was already elsewhere. They made their way through the cemetery, weaving between rows of white headstones that stretched endlessly in every direction. Henry had been here before, too many times to count, but this time felt different. He wasn't just saying goodbye. He was bringing something back to life. By the time they reached his truck, the silence between them had settled into something comfortable, a quiet understanding that neither of them needed to put into words just yet. As they pulled onto the road, Henry stole a glance at Emily. She was staring out the window, her lips pressed together in deep thought. "Your father was a good man," he said after a moment. Emily turned, meeting his gaze. "I believe you," she said softly. I wish I had known him." Henry gripped the wheel a little tighter. "You're about to?" he said. And with that, he drove toward the place where Jimmy Carter's final words waited to be read. The cemetery was silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves carried by the wind. A few clouds lingered in the sky, casting momentary shadows over the rows of white headstones. Daniel took a slow, measured breath. His old army dress blues fit snugly around his frame, though time had softened his once powerful shoulders. He had spent years avoiding this place, avoiding the memories buried beneath these markers, but today he had no choice. He turned his gaze to the young woman standing before him. Her name was Emily Carter, the daughter of Sergeant James Carter, Daniel's closest friend in Iraq. A friend Daniel had sworn to protect, but had ultimately failed. Emily's presence here was a wound reopened, a reminder of the burden he had carried for decades. She was in her late 20s now, her dark eyes scanning his face as if searching for answers he wasn't ready to give. The resemblance to her father was uncanny, the sharp jawline, the determined gaze. The way she stood, almost defiant, like James had been when they were in the field together. Daniel swallowed hard. "You were with my father," Emily finally spoke, her voice firm yet uncertain. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, we served together. He was the best of us." Emily took a deep breath, her fingers clutching the neatly folded flag in her hands. The funeral was over, but she had stayed behind after everyone else left, waiting for him, waiting for the man whose name had been mentioned in her father's letters. "He mentioned you," she said, glancing down at the headstone. "Said you had each other's backs no matter what." Daniel clenched his jaw. "We did." She looked back up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Then why weren't you there when it mattered?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He had asked himself the same thing 1,000 times. He had lived with the guilt, the what-ifs, the sleepless nights. "I tried," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I tried to get to him, but—" He shook his head, exhaling sharply. It was too late. Emily didn't react immediately. She simply stood there, staring at him, weighing his words. "I read the reports," she said, "the official ones at least. But reports don't tell the whole story, do they?" Daniel inhaled deeply. "No, they don't." For the first time he saw a flicker of emotion cross her face, something beyond anger. Pain? Grief? "I just need to know," she whispered. "Did he suffer?" Daniel took a step forward, his voice soft but steady. "No. He went down fighting, just like he always said he would. He saved lives that day, Emily, including mine." Emily closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "Then tell me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Tell me everything." Daniel nodded. For the first time in years he was ready to break the silence. "And so," he began, Daniel Lawson had spent years running from this moment. Every night the memories crept back in, the flashes of gunfire, the deafening explosions, the smell of dust and blood in the air. But the worst of them was Jimmy Carter's last moments. Now, standing here in front of Jimmy's daughter, Daniel knew there was no more running. She deserved the truth. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he looked at Emily. She was still gripping her father's old notebook like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the ground. "You want to know what happened?" he asked, his voice lower now, heavier. Emily nodded, her expression unreadable. Daniel looked away for a moment, gathering himself before speaking. "It was a routine convoy mission, or at least that's what it was supposed to be," he started. "We were moving supplies to a forward operating base. Jimmy was leading the unit, and I was right beside him." He clenched his fists at the memory. "Halfway through, we hit an ambush. An IED went off, flipped one of our Humvees. Before we even had time to react, bullets were coming from all directions." Emily's eyes never left him. "Jimmy didn't hesitate," Daniel continued, shaking his head slightly. "He took charge, like he always did. He got to the wounded first, pulled men from the wreckage while we lay down cover fire. He kept shouting orders, keeping everyone in the fight. And then he saw one of our guys pinned down behind the burning Humvee." Daniel's breath hitched for a moment. Without thinking, Jimmy ran straight into enemy fire. He didn't care about the bullets, didn't care that we were yelling at him to wait. He just went. Emily inhaled sharply, but she said nothing. "Got to him," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "He dragged that kid to safety. But just as he turned to run back, Daniel stopped, swallowing hard. He had never said these words out loud before. He took a round to the side, Daniel finally forced out. Another to the leg, but even then he stayed up, kept fighting. He took cover behind the wreckage and kept laying down fire while we regrouped. He saved us, Emily. She exhaled slowly, as if she had been holding her breath the entire time. Daniel ran a hand down his face, his voice quiet now. By the time we reached him, he was already slipping away. I held him. I told him help was coming, that he just had to hang on. He blinked hard, forcing the memory away. But he knew he wasn't making it home. And the last thing he said to me, before he closed his eyes, was, "Your name." Emily's entire body went still. "He whispered it," Daniel said, staring at her now. "Emily." That was the last thing he said before he was gone. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "He loved you," Daniel whispered. "He never stopped talking about you. He carried your picture with him every damn day. He wanted you to know that, no matter what." Emily covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking as silent sobs racked through her. Daniel took a step closer, his voice softer now. "He wasn't just my brother in arms," he said. "He was your father, and everything he did it for you." Emily let out a broken breath. "Thank you," she whispered. For the first time in decades, Daniel felt something lift off his shoulders, the weight of guilt, of unfinished business, of promises left unfulfilled. And as Emily wiped her tears, clutching her father's notebook to her chest, he knew. This was what Jimmy had wanted all along. Daniel had always believed that war never really ended for the ones who survived it. The battlefields might fade into memory, but the weight of those lost, the ghosts of the fallen, remained forever. He had carried Jimmy Carter's ghost for over 30 years, never knowing how to put him to rest. Now, standing here with Emily, watching her struggle to hold back tears, he realized something. This wasn't about closure for him. This was about giving Jimmy's daughter the truth she deserved. Emily wiped at her eyes, her fingers tightening around her father's notebook. Her voice wavered when she finally spoke. "You talked about me?" she asked, almost as if she didn't believe it. Daniel exhaled, nodding. "All the time. You were what kept him going. He had this picture of you, must have been from when you were 5 or 6. He kept it in his helmet. Said no matter how bad things got, one look at that picture reminded him why he was fighting." Emily swallowed hard, her lips pressing together as she tried to compose herself. "I never knew that." "You were his world, Emily," Daniel said softly. "He wasn't just fighting for his country. He was fighting to make sure you had a future." She closed her eyes for a brief moment, and when she opened them again there was a quiet strength there. "I used to think he didn't care, that maybe he chose the Army over being a dad, but hearing this, I was wrong, wasn't I?" Daniel nodded. "Jimmy didn't choose the Army over you. He chose it because of you. He wanted to protect you, even from halfway across the world." A silence settled between them, heavy but no longer suffocating, the kind of silence that spoke of wounds too deep to heal in a single conversation. After a moment, Emily looked down at the notebook in her hands. "I've had this for years, but I never had the courage to read all of it. I was scared of what I might find, scared that he might not have been the man I wanted him to be." She hesitated. "But now, I think I need to know. I need to read his words." Daniel watched her carefully. "You don't have to do it alone." She looked up, searching his face. Would you read them with me?" Daniel felt his chest tighten. The request was simple, but the meaning behind it wasn't. Emily wasn't just asking him to read a notebook. She was asking him to help her carry the weight of Jimmy's memory. He took a deep breath, then nodded. Yeah, I'd like that." Emily stepped closer, opening the notebook to the first page. The writing was faded but strong. Jimmy's handwriting, frozen in time. Daniel looked at the words, his throat tightening as he read the first line aloud. "Emily, if you're reading this, then I'm not coming home." Emily let out a shaky breath, her hands gripping the pages. Daniel placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "We'll go through it together," he said. And for the first time in over 30 years, Daniel felt like he wasn't alone anymore. The pages of Jimmy Carter's notebook turned softly in Emily's hands, the worn leather creaking as if it too carried the weight of time. She and Daniel Lawson sat on a wooden bench beneath the old oak tree at the cemetery, just a few yards away from Jimmy's final resting place. The sun was beginning to set, casting golden hues over the sea of white headstones. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of moment Jimmy had never had the chance to see. Emily traced her fingers over her father's handwriting, as if trying to connect with the man she had never truly known. "Emily, if you're reading this, then I'm not coming home." The first sentence alone made her throat tighten, but Daniel's steady presence beside her gave her the strength to continue. Jimmy's words were raw, unfiltered, written in stolen moments between battles. He wrote about missing her first steps, her birthdays, the way he imagined her laughing. He wrote about his regrets, about the war, about the things he had seen that he wished he could forget. But through it all, one thing remained clear: his love for her. Daniel listened as she read aloud, his own emotions catching in his chest. Every line took him back to the nights they spent in the barracks, to the conversations about home, to the quiet moments when Jimmy had confided in him about his fears. He had never truly realized the depth of Jimmy's pain until now. Emily wiped her eyes but kept going. She refused to let the emotions stop her now. Then she reached the final page. "And if I don't make it back, I need you to know something. You are the best thing I ever did in this world. Not the missions, not the medals. You. I hope you grow up to be strong, to be kind, and I hope that one day you'll find someone who can tell you how much I loved you when I couldn't. If that person is Daniel, then I know you're in good hands." Emily stopped. The words hit like a freight train. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. She turned her head to look at Daniel, and the old veteran could only stare at the words, his heart hammering in his chest. Jimmy had known. Even in the middle of war, even in his last moments, he had been thinking about this. About her. About Daniel. Daniel swallowed hard. He left this for us," he said quietly. Even back then he knew. Emily closed the notebook, holding it tightly to her chest. She turned to face Daniel fully now, her expression shifting from sorrow to something else. "Gratitude. You kept your promise," she whispered. Daniel exhaled sharply, a small, sad smile forming on his lips. "Took me 30 years, but yeah, I did." Emily reached out, and without hesitation, Daniel pulled her into a hug. Not out of duty, not out of guilt, but because, in this moment, they were no longer just strangers connected by the past. They were family. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel stood up and gave one final salute to Jimmy's grave. "Rest easy, brother," he murmured. "She's got me now." Emily smiled softly beside him. For the first time in her life, she truly believed that she wasn't alone. And as they walked away from the cemetery, the past no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a bridge, a promise finally fulfilled.